The grand hall of the Alpha King's palace gleamed with golden candlelight, each flicker dancing over polished marble floors and towering columns. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries, telling stories of battles won and kingdoms forged long before any living soul had been born. Tonight, the hall was alive with laughter, clinking goblets, and the chatter of nobles. Music swirled through the air, played by skilled minstrels, their fingers flying over strings and keys as voices rose and fell in harmony. Among the crowd, the Alpha King sat at the high table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the hall. His armor gleamed like a river of molten metal, each polished plate reflecting the glow of torchlight. Around him, lords and ladies bowed, whispered, and toasted, careful to maintain favor with the ruler whose temper could turn from calm to fury in a heartbeat. But in the corner of the hall, blending almost perfectly into the shadows, moved someone who did not belong to the games of power or the display of wealth. The quiet Omega, as he was known in whispered palace circles, walked slowly between the tables, his eyes observing more than anyone else dared. His movements were soft, deliberate, almost ghost-like, and his gaze drifted not toward the laughter or the gold, but toward the people, their posture, the tension in their shoulders, the tiniest twitch of a hand. No one noticed him, as he intended. That was how he worked best. Invisible, silent, yet always aware. He had been trained, or perhaps cursed, with a sense others could not understand. He could feel the air shift around, someone plotting, smell emotions carried faintly through the crowd, and sense intentions hidden behind polite smiles. As the king raised his goblet to toast a visiting duke, a faint, strange scent reached the Omega. It was subtle, barely more than a whisper of danger, something metallic and sweet, like copper mixed with smoke. A warning. He paused, pressing a finger lightly to the rim of a nearby table to steady himself. The scent grew stronger as it moved closer to the king, almost invisible to everyone else. The Omega's heart quickened. He knew, without doubt, that someone had poisoned the air. Perhaps it was in the wine. Perhaps it was in the food. The nobles around him laughed and toasted, unaware that the king's life hung by a single invisible thread. He considered speaking, but his training, or perhaps the curse that bound him, made his lips still. No one must know what he sensed. If he acted too openly, he could draw suspicion. Worse, someone could see him as a threat. The king laughed at a joke the duke made, leaning back in his chair, his hand brushing the golden hilt of his sword. The Omega's eyes tracked the movements of the servants. The cups, the platters, every step, every gesture could carry death if he miscalculated. Finally, the moment arrived. One of the goblets, a delicate crystal cup filled with wine, was lifted toward the king's lips. The Omega's eyes narrowed. The faint scent of danger clung to it. No one else seemed to notice the king's hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for it. Without hesitation, the Omega stepped forward, not boldly, but with precision. He bumped the hand of the servant ever so lightly, spilling a drop of wine onto the king's armor. The golden metal caught the light, and the king's eyes followed the movement instinctively. "What?" the king began, his deep voice cutting through the music. His eyes landed on the figure standing slightly bowed, head lowered. The Omega did not meet his gaze. He merely nodded, as if the motion itself could speak the warning words his lips could not. The king's hand froze mid-air. Something in the Omega's posture, the way his body tensed yet remained calm, told the king that this was no ordinary interference. His instincts, honed over years of battles and betrayals, recognized that a threat had been avoided. The nobleman whose wine had been spilled stammered in protest, but the king raised a hand, silencing him. "Leave it," he said, his gaze lingering on the quiet figure. The Omega melted back into the shadows, disappearing as swiftly as he had appeared. The hall erupted in laughter once more, the tension unnoticed by the crowd. Music filled the air again. Though the king's eyes did not leave the spot where the Omega had been, there was something about him, something dangerous yet intriguing. Later, in the private corridors of the palace, the king could not stop thinking about the quiet Omega. Who was he? How had he sensed the danger no one else in the hall had noticed? Yet this figure had acted with perfect timing, saving the king's life without a word. Meanwhile, the Omega retreated to a quiet chamber, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His senses still hummed with the memory of the scent, the closeness of death that had hovered just inches from the king. He knew that tonight would change everything. By saving the king, he had drawn attention to himself, attention he had always avoided. Yet, despite the fear, there was a strange thrill. A connection he could not explain had sparked between him and the king in that brief, wordless encounter. Something unspoken had passed between them. A recognition of power, of danger, and of a shared understanding that went beyond words. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that its fate had shifted in that fleeting moment. Shadows moved differently in the corridors, and the torchlight seemed to burn brighter, casting long, almost sentient shapes across the walls. Somewhere deep within the ancient stones, old magic stirred, awakened by the Omega's action. The king, seated alone in his private chamber later that night, stared at the goblet that had nearly taken his life. His mind replayed the Omega's movements, the way his presence had been invisible yet decisive. A part of him, the part that hungered for both control and understanding, felt a pull toward this silent figure. He stood abruptly, the soft click of his boots on the marble echoing in the empty hall. "Find him," he ordered one of his guards, though the words were quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "I need to know who saved me." The guard hesitated, sensing the unusual intensity in the king's tone, but nodded and left. Meanwhile, the Omega remained hidden, unaware that the command had been given. He sensed nothing but the lingering shadows and the quiet hum of magic in the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the palace towers, carrying the faint scent that had first warned the Omega of danger. Somewhere in the distance, the city slept, unaware of the night's close brush with death. And within the palace, two lives, one powerful and commanding, the other quiet and watchful, were drawn together by an invisible thread. Neither knew what would come next, but both felt the weight of a destiny beginning to unfold. The king, for the first time in many years, felt vulnerable and curious. The Omega, for the first time in many years, felt seen and alive. And so, the night lingered, heavy with unspoken promises and the faintest hint of what was to come. The quiet Omega had acted without recognition, without reward, but his actions would not remain hidden for long. The Alpha King, intrigued and unsettled, would not let it be. Somewhere in the shadows, the Omega caught a faint whisper of movement. He stiffened, though no one was there. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the events of tonight had changed everything. And in that moment, the first thread of connection was spun, a bond that would test power, challenge fate, and awaken something neither of them could yet name. The feast had ended, but the story was only beginning. The night in the palace was unusually still. The grand hall where the feast had taken place now lay in silence. Its candles burned low, casting trembling shadows across the marble floors. The nobles had retired to their chambers, carrying with them whispers of laughter, gossip, and the near catastrophe that had been narrowly avoided. But one presence in the palace remained awake, moving quietly along the corridors with soft, deliberate steps. The quiet Omega lingered in the shadows, his senses still heightened from the events of the feast. Every corner, every corridor, seemed to hum with tension. Though he had saved the Alpha King, he had not been seen clearly, and yet he felt eyes upon him. Not many, but one. The king. The Alpha King sat alone in his chamber, his fingers tracing the rim of a goblet he had not yet emptied. The taste of wine lingered, but his mind was far from the drink. He had been raised to read people, to judge intentions before words were spoken, and tonight had tested every instinct he possessed. Something about the quiet Omega was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. The boy, or was he, a young man, had moved with an ease that belied fear. And yet there was something restrained in him, a self-control that the king found fascinating. He could not tell if it was bravery or instinct, but he knew that whatever force had guided the Omega's hand had saved his life. He rose abruptly, the armor at his shoulders creaking slightly, and paced the room. He could not rest, while a mystery remained unsolved. With a heavy sigh, he called for one of his trusted guards. "Find him," he said, voice firm yet edged with a curiosity he had never allowed before. "I want to see the one who dared act in silence tonight. Bring him here." The guard hesitated, sensing the unusual tone in the king's voice, but nodded quickly. "As you command, my king." He left, his boots echoing down the empty halls. Meanwhile, the Omega moved toward the library, a hidden sanctuary few in the palace knew existed. The room smelled of parchment, ink, and dust, the scent of knowledge and secrets. Here, the Omega felt safe. Here, he could breathe. He ran his fingers lightly along the spines of ancient tomes, feeling the weight of centuries and the stories they held. He knew he could not stay hidden forever. The king's interest would not be easily denied. And soon, he would have to confront the one who had seen him act. The thought made his heart tighten, a mixture of fear and something else, a feeling he did not yet understand. As the Omega studied the tomes, his mind wandered to the curse that had bound him for so long. It had been placed upon his family generations ago. A punishment, or perhaps a protection. He could never fully tell. The curse demanded silence in the presence of royalty, a strange constraint that had shaped his entire life. He could sense things others could not, but he could never speak freely of them when kings or queens were near. It had kept him hidden, safe, and lonely. Yet tonight, he had broken it not with words, but with action. And in doing so, he had drawn attention to himself. A faint sound broke his thoughts, a whisper of movement near the library doors. He froze, heart hammering. Shadows shifted, and for a moment, he thought the king himself had come. But it was only one of the palace servants, moving cautiously in the quiet night. Still, the Omega could not shake the feeling of eyes upon him. Somewhere, in the dark, he was being watched. Meanwhile, the king's search had brought him closer to the truth. He moved silently through the corridors, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. He did not need it. Not yet. But the habit of vigilance was ingrained, a constant reminder of the dangers that surrounded him. The guards had found nothing. No trace of the Omega. No clue to the boy's identity. The king's frustration grew, mingled with an unexpected fascination. He could not understand why a figure so quiet and unassuming could command such precise courage. It was as though the Omega had seen not only danger but the very essence of the king himself and chosen to protect it. That thought stirred something deep within him, a longing he had never named. He had always ruled by strength, by fear, by control, and yet, the quiet Omega had reminded him that power alone was not enough. There was value in insight, in patience, in understanding the world in ways others could not. Hours passed, the night stretching long and quiet. And then, as the first hint of dawn touched the palace towers, the king finally found himself in front of the hidden library. He paused, sensing the presence inside before he even opened the door. Something about the room called to him, a mixture of stillness and alertness that felt familiar yet foreign. He stepped inside quietly, the faint light illuminating rows of ancient books. And there, in the far corner, the quiet Omega sat, hunched over a leather-bound volume, as if nothing in the world existed beyond the pages. The king's eyes narrowed. "I know you are here," he said softly, yet firmly. The sound of his voice was like steel, and the Omega stiffened, his gaze snapping up. Their eyes met. The king's were sharp, commanding, yet edged with curiosity. The Omega's were guarded, yet something flickered within them. Fear, yes, but also recognition. "I should not speak to you," the Omega whispered, though his words trembled slightly. "You do not know me." "I do not need to know your name," the king replied, stepping closer. "I need to understand why you saved me tonight." The Omega's pulse quickened, He could not speak fully, not of the curse, not of the senses that guided him, but he could act, and sometimes actions spoke louder than words. He closed the book gently and rose, keeping his gaze low. "I sensed danger," he said finally, his voice quiet, careful. "I could not let it happen." The king studied him, every detail, the set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands, the way he seemed to carry both fear and determination. He realized that this figure was unlike anyone he had ever met. Not a noble, not a knight, not a courtier, someone entirely apart from the rules and expectations of the palace, yet intimately aware of its dangers. "You have skill," the king said, his tone softer now, almost a whisper. "And courage. Tell me, do you always act alone?" The Omega shook his head slightly. "I work in silence, always." The king's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Then perhaps silence suits you, for now. But you will not remain invisible to me for long." A shiver ran down the Omega's spine, though he did not move. The weight of the king's gaze was different from fear. It was a mixture of curiosity, intensity, and something unspoken that made the air between them tremble. For a moment, they simply regarded each other. The quiet library filled with an unspoken tension. The Omega could feel the king's power, the authority that radiated from him like heat from a forge, and yet, beneath that, he sensed vulnerability, a longing for trust, for understanding, for someone who could see beyond the armor of the throne. The Omega realized, with a mixture of dread and fascination, that the king was not just observing him, he was measuring him, testing him, trying to understand him in a way no one else had ever attempted. "You will not leave this palace unnoticed again," the king said finally, turning to leave. "I will find a way to see the truth in your silence. And when I do—" His voice trailed, unfinished, leaving a weight in the air that the Omega could almost touch. The Omega returned to his hidden corner, heart racing. The king's presence lingered like a shadow, long after he had gone. He had survived the feast, but he knew that a new kind of challenge awaited. A challenge of trust, of courage, and of unspoken connection. The palace itself seemed to sense the shift. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier with expectation. Somewhere in the walls, ancient magic whispered, stirred by the bond forming between the Alpha King and the quiet Omega. And somewhere in the city beyond the palace, dangers stirred as well. The threat that had almost claimed the king's life had not vanished. It had only been delayed, and the Omega's senses already picked up faint traces of plotting, whispers of betrayal that no one else could hear. The Omega sat quietly, listening to the faint hum of the palace, settling into the early hours of morning. He knew that tonight was only the beginning, and that his path was now entwined with the king's. A bond had formed, fragile yet undeniable, forged in danger, secrecy, and the unspoken understanding of two souls meeting across the boundaries of fear and power. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows, spilling over the pages of his book and illuminating the Omega's face. For the first time, he allowed himself a faint smile, not of triumph, but of anticipation. The story was far from over, and already, he could feel the threads of fate drawing tighter. And somewhere deep within the palace, the Alpha King prepared for a day that would not be like any other, a day where shadows would speak, and a quiet Omega would change the course of everything he had ever known. The palace was cloaked in a silver haze as twilight fell, the last rays of sunlight slipping through tall, arched windows. The hallways, usually bustling with guards and servants, were silent, as if the stones themselves had learned to hold their breath. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, marking the coming of evening. But it echoed differently tonight, a hollow sound, like a warning whispered through ancient walls. The quiet Omega moved through the corridors, his senses alert to the faintest movement. Something stirred in the palace, something he could feel but not yet see. The air carried a subtle tension, like the pause before a storm. He followed it instinctively, silent as a shadow, until he reached the library, the sanctuary he had come to rely on. The Alpha King was already there, waiting. He had not called for the Omega in the usual way, nor had he sent a guard. The king's presence was enough to command the room, and yet tonight, he seemed different, less rigid, less imposing, and more curious than ever. "You came," the king said, his voice low, almost cautious. "I thought perhaps you might avoid me." "Ride." The Omega bowed slightly, careful to keep his expression unreadable. "I could not," he whispered. "There are things I sense, things that cannot wait." The king studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of unease in his eyes. "You saved me twice now," he said softly, stepping closer. "And yet I know you hide much from me. Tell me, why?" The Omega hesitated, a shadow passing over his features. The curse that had bound him for years pressed against his lips. He could not speak freely, not of the gift, and not of the price it demanded. To reveal it fully would be to betray himself. And yet, the weight of silence had become unbearable. I am bound," he said finally, choosing words carefully. "There are forces that demand my silence in the presence of kings. I sense things others cannot, but I cannot speak of them freely." The king's gaze darkened, a mixture of surprise and fascination crossing his face. He had faced threats, betrayal, and treachery. But he had never encountered a force like this one that was invisible, silent, yet powerful enough to alter the course of life and death. "You mean to say," the king murmured, "that you can see dangers before they happen? But you cannot warn anyone?" The Omega nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, it is a burden I have carried all my life." The king stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And yet you acted tonight. You intervened. You saved me. How could you break the curse?" The Omega's lips pressed together, and he shook his head. "I did not break it. Not fully. I acted in the moment, guided by instinct and necessity. But there are consequences. Always consequences." The king's hand hovered near his chin, thinking, calculating. He had never been one to surrender control, yet this Omega challenged every expectation he had. The boy or man possessed a strength unlike any soldier or advisor he had ever known. Courage, intelligence, and a restraint that made the king uneasy, in ways he could not name. "Then you must teach me," the king said quietly, almost to himself. "Teach me to understand. If danger comes again, I must trust you, and I must protect you as well." The Omega blinked, startled. Few had ever spoken of protecting him, and none had asked for his guidance. He studied the king's face, searching for deceit, for arrogance, for the usual pride that came with royalty. But there was none. The Alpha King stood before him, vulnerable in a way the Omega had never imagined, and yet commanding every inch of the room with his presence. "I cannot promise safety," the Omega said softly, "but I will guide you. I will warn you, as best I can." For a moment, silence filled the library, thick and heavy. Outside, the palace seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the fragile bond forming between the two. The king finally nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we are bound, you and I," he said. "By danger, by fate, and perhaps by something more." The Omega's heart skipped a beat, though he did not show it. Fate, he realized, was a force neither of them could escape. And the danger was far from over. Hours passed, and the palace settled into the quiet of night. But the Omega sensed it, the lingering threat that had nearly claimed the king's life. Someone within the palace plotted, hidden in plain sight. The scent of deceit was faint but unmistakable, carried on the movements of those who smiled too easily, who lingered too long near the king's table. He followed it, moving silently through hidden corridors and staircases, tracing the presence that sought to harm the king. Every step, every breath, brought him closer to a truth that chilled him. The danger was closer than he had imagined, and the king could not see it. The king, meanwhile, had not been idle. He moved through the palace with quiet purpose, checking on his guards, inspecting the kitchens, and speaking softly with advisors. And yet, his mind kept returning to the Omega, to the boy who had acted without fear, who had sensed the threat before anyone else. He could not explain the pull he felt, the curiosity that bordered on obsession. As the night deepened, the Omega and the king found themselves drawn together once more. In a secluded courtyard, bathed in moonlight, the king faced the Omega directly. "Tell me what you sense," he demanded, his voice low, yet filled with an unusual softness. "If there is a threat, I must know it. I must trust you." The Omega inhaled slowly, gathering his courage. "There is someone here," he said finally. "Someone who watches, waits, and plans. They hide behind smiles and courtesies. But I can feel them. They are close to you, closer than you realize." The king's eyes narrowed, scanning the courtyard as if the shadows themselves might answer. "Closer than I realize?" he repeated. "Do you mean someone in the palace?" The Omega nodded. "Yes. And they are patient. They will not act until the moment is perfect. We must be ready." The king's hand brushed the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. Instead, he regarded the Omega with a new understanding. "Then we will act together," he said. "You guide me, and I will protect you. We are partners in this." The Omega's heart raced. Partners. The word was strange, foreign, yet not unwelcome. He had lived in the shadows, hidden and alone, for so long. And now, for the first time, he felt that he was seen not just as a servant or a spy, but as someone whose skills and courage mattered. They spent the hours that remained of the night speaking in whispers, devising ways to protect the king, to uncover the traitor. Each plan was carefully measured, each move considered, and through it all, the king began to see the Omega not just as a guide, but as a companion, someone whose presence brought clarity and even comfort. The Omega, in turn, began to see the king in a new light. Beneath the armor, the authority, and the reputation, there was a man who was willing to trust, willing to listen, and willing to act, not out of fear, but out of a desire to understand. For the first time in his life, the Omega felt that his gift and his curse might not be a burden alone, but a bridge to someone who could see him fully. As dawn approached, the courtyard was quiet, bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. The threat remained, hidden, but the bond between the king and the Omega had been forged in shared vigilance and silent understanding. The palace itself seemed to recognize the change, as if the ancient stones approved of the alliance forming within its walls. And then, in the far shadows of the courtyard, the Omega sensed a movement quick, deliberate, almost predatory. Someone was watching them, someone who had slipped past all precautions. The Omega's eyes narrowed, and he moved instinctively between the king and the shadow. The king followed his movement, his own instincts sharpening. "Who is it?" he asked quietly. The Omega did not answer. He could not yet. He only knew that the danger had arrived, and that this time, it was closer than ever. They stood together, silent yet united, waiting for the moment when the shadow would reveal itself. The threat had grown, the danger was real, and the palace was no longer safe. But for the first time, the Omega felt that he was not alone. And the king, for the first time, realized that true strength could be found not just in power, but in trust. The first thread of danger tightened around them, unseen and silent, yet undeniable. And the Omega knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the next move would not be a test of skill alone. It would be a test of trust, courage, and the bond that had begun to form between him and the Alpha King. The palace courtyard was bathed in the pale light of dawn, the golden sun creeping slowly over the towers and spires. The shadows that had haunted the halls through the night still lingered, long and wavering, as if reluctant to leave. The quiet Omega stood tense, his senses alert to the presence before them. The shadow had moved, revealing itself, and the Omega's instincts told him that the danger was more intimate than he could have imagined. It was someone the king trusted, someone close, whose smile had hidden ambition and malice. The Omega felt a chill run through him. The Alpha King, standing tall beside him, had no idea that the threat was not a stranger lurking in the night, but someone whose betrayal cut deeper than any blade. "Step forward," the king commanded, voice steady but cold. "Show yourself." The traitor, a trusted advisor of many years, emerged fully into the light, feigning calm but trembling beneath the gaze of the king and the Omega. Their hand hovered near a hidden dagger at their side, but the king's eyes were like iron, unyielding and unflinching. The Omega stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between the king and the advisor. "Do not try anything," he said softly, voice calm but edged with warning. "I know what you intend," the advisor sneered, a flicker of fear in their eyes betraying the confidence they had tried to show. "And who are you to stop me? A silent shadow in the corners of this palace." The Omega met their gaze evenly, not flinching. "I see more than you think, and I will protect him." The Alpha King's eyes softened, admiration mingling with relief. "He is right," the king said, his voice firm. "Your plans end here." For a moment, it seemed the tension might erupt into violence, but the Omega did not act with haste. Instead, he relied on his senses, predicting every subtle movement, every twitch, every heartbeat. The advisor faltered, uncertainty creeping in. The king advanced slowly, his steps deliberate, not threatening, but commanding. "You chose betrayal," he said, voice low but carrying through the courtyard. "Do you not understand that loyalty is everything in this palace?" "Whoa," the advisor hesitated. And in that pause, the Omega moved. Swift and precise. He guided the king aside, just as the advisor lunged. Attempting to strike, their dagger clattered harmlessly against the marble. And the king, though startled, recovered quickly, drawing his sword with a smooth, practiced motion. "You see?" the Omega whispered, voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I told you. We must act together." The king nodded, eyes sharp and focused. "I trust you," he said simply. It was a rare admission from a man who had ruled by fear and strength for years. And the Omega, hidden yet brave, felt the weight of that trust as keenly as any blade. The advisor, realizing their plan had failed, tried to retreat, but the king's soldiers, alerted by the subtle signals from the Omega, closed in. The once confident traitor faltered, and in that moment, the palace claimed them, justice swift and silent. The courtyard grew quiet again, the tension slowly dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The threat had been neutralized, and the palace was safe, but something had shifted irrevocably between the Alpha King and the quiet Omega. The king sheathed his sword, turning fully to face the Omega. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly, his voice carrying both gratitude and awe. "And yet you remain hidden, silent, and apart. Tell me, why?" The Omega lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of centuries of restraint, of the curse that had bound him. I am bound to silence," he said, his words slow and careful. "It is a curse from my family, from long ago. I can sense things no one else can, but I cannot speak freely around royalty." The king stepped closer, his presence both commanding and gentle. "Then let us break it," he said, "together. If it holds you, then it binds you only in fear. But fear is no longer yours to carry alone." The Omega hesitated, unsure if breaking the curse was truly possible. But as he looked at the king, the man who had trusted him, respected him, and relied on him, he felt a courage he had not known before. Slowly, he nodded. A faint shimmer of light passed through the courtyard, subtle and almost imperceptible, as if the palace itself acknowledged the decision. The curse, long, silent, and oppressive, loosened its hold, though it did not vanish entirely. The Omega could now speak more freely, act more openly, and share his gifts without the same suffocating restraint. "You have changed everything," the Omega whispered, voice stronger than it had ever been. "Not just for me, but for the palace. For you." The king's eyes softened, and he reached out, lightly brushing a hand against the Omega's arm. "No," he said. "You have changed me. You have shown me what true courage is, what loyalty means, and that strength is not only in power, but in wisdom and trust." The two stood in the courtyard, sunlight spilling over them, casting long, intertwining shadows. The palace had survived, the danger had passed, and yet the moment was more profound than any battle, more intimate than any feast. The bond between them had been forged in silence, in danger, and in trust. The Omega finally allowed himself a faint smile. A rare, genuine expression that had been hidden behind layers of restraint for so long. I will stay," he said softly, almost shyly. "If you wish it." The king smiled in return, the weight of his usual authority softened by gratitude, and something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. "I do," he said simply. "Stay with me. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as my partner, my equal, my trusted guide." The Omega felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging he had never known. For years, he had moved through the world unseen, his gifts a secret burden. Now, he was recognized, valued, and trusted. And in the presence of the Alpha King, he felt more alive than ever before. As the morning light grew stronger, the palace seemed to hum with a quiet energy. Guards and servants emerged from their chambers, finding the courtyard peaceful and orderly. The grand halls no longer seemed ominous but alive with the promise of a new day. The king and the Omega walked together through the palace, their steps in harmony, their silence comfortable rather than tense. There was no need for words. Their connection spoke volumes, a bond forged in danger and trust. And yet, even as the palace returned to its usual rhythm, the memory of the traitor lingered. The Alpha King and the quiet Omega both knew that threats would come again, that power and envy would never fully sleep. But now, they faced the future together, united, vigilant, and stronger for the bond they had formed. In the quiet moments between dawn and the bustle of the day, the king finally spoke again, softer this time. "You may speak now," he said. "Tell me your thoughts. Share what you see. No longer do you need to hide in silence." The Omega looked up, meeting the king's gaze with a calmness he had never felt before. "I see a future," he said quietly, "where we protect each other, and where trust is stronger than fear." The king nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Then let us walk that path together." The palace stood around them, ancient and wise, its stones having witnessed countless battles, betrayals, and alliances. But today, it bore witness to something different. The beginning of a bond that was both quiet and profound, forged in the shadows, and now illuminated by trust, courage, and understanding. The Alpha King and the quiet Omega had faced danger, uncovered secrets, and survived betrayal. They had found something rare in a world of power and deceit, a connection that transcended fear, a bond that would guide them through the trials ahead. And as the sun rose fully over the palace towers, casting light over marble floors and gilded halls, the Omega realized that for the first time, he was no longer invisible. He was seen, respected, and trusted. And beside him, the king, strong, commanding, yet unexpectedly gentle, stood ready to face whatever came next. Together, the palace was safe. The threat had been stopped, and the bond between them was unbreakable.